Welcome, everyone, to week 10 in our online classroom. I'm glad to have you back. It's been a while since we've seen each other, so I will be introducing our unit theme, and I'll be going over a little bit of what we missed last class since I was out, and then we'll delve right into the ancient Aegean, which is the topic for this week. Now, you will notice we don't have a daily analysis or a minute reflection today. Instead, you're going to be completing this module and participating in the discussions below. So let's jump right in, and please bear with me. This is the fifth lecture I record today, so I am a little bit tired. But here is our theme for this unit, the body in art. It is one that I am super excited about, and our question this unit is, what is the relationship between culture and representations of the human body? So last unit, we were really touching on the elements and principles and getting those down and understanding how artists use those to communicate meaning. Now we're going to take a step back and look instead at particular cultures and the way that particular cultures represent the human body. Because if you look across at different cultures, you're going to see very different representations of the human body. And one of the questions that we ask in this unit is, why are they so different? Okay, so let's jump right in. Now, the human figure in art is represented in several themes. The first one here being religion and spirituality. So we see representations of human like gods or humanoid gods. Documentary. So history paintings, paintings that represent particular individuals, which leads us to leaders, representations of leaders. So this could be sculptures, paintings, photographs, also social commentary. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the human figure has been used to bring awareness to socially marginalized groups. It has been used to bring attention to different social issues, as we'll see kind of later on through the unit. Now, it has also been used in propaganda, and this is a huge one, of course. We'll see instances of the use of the human figure in ancient Egyptian propaganda. The one that you are seeing here in this slide, of course, the famous David from Michelangelo, is a form of propaganda. Of course, it is showing the might of the city of Florence against Goliath. Of course, David fights against Goliath. David is supposed to be a 12-year-old boy, which, he's not quite a 12-year-old boy in this representation, but he is supposed to be the underdog. And so it is very much the Florentines using the figure of David as propaganda. Now, we'll also see it in performance. And in performance, I don't necessarily mean traditional theatrical performance or dance, but I mean a combination of the theatrical arts, the performing arts, with the visual arts. Now, this could be something like 1970s performance art, as we'll see in a few minutes what that looks like. But it could also be African dance using masks or the ancient Mayan ball games. All of those are sorts of performances using the human figure, and also just for pleasure. And of course, here we're getting into the realm of, sometimes it could have been considered pornography, and in other societies, it's considered art, right? So there is a hazy border between these two designations when it comes to art. And different societies see different types of art as either being pornographic or not. Of course, there are certain societies where you would not see representations of nude men, as we're seeing in this slide, while in others, the female figure was not meant to be shown nude. So we'll talk more about some of those social taboos when it comes to the human figure. All right. Was having some trouble there getting to the next slide. Now, the first one I mentioned was gods. Now, gods are often represented as humanoid in different cultures. They're often slightly apart from humankind in that they have different characteristics, meaning sometimes they are idealized humans. That's what we're going to see with the ancient Greeks. And sometimes they have extra limbs, or they are blue, or they are also part animal. So we're going to see that they are human like, but they are often set apart from the rest of humankind. Now, they often have human like personalities. And again, we're going to see this in ancient Egypt, in ancient Greece. We're going to see this. You can see this again also in the Shiva Nataraja that we see right here. And I'm probably going to have you watch a video on this particular god either today or in the next following weeks. Now, the other one I mentioned was leaders, and here is a lovely portrait of Napoleon. Of course, in this portrait, he's often criticized for maybe trying a little too hard, right? So, leaders used painting, they use sculpture, they use photographs, all sorts of different types of art forms as propaganda. And one of the questions that a leader often asks him or herself is, how do you want to be portrayed? Now, this tells us a little bit about how Napoleon wanted to be portrayed, but actually, after this painting was done to his specifications, he looked at it and he said, "Oh, you know, that probably does not represent me in the most flattering light." So he actually hated this portrait of himself. But he was very famous for having a lot of portraits done of himself. Now, these type of portraits can create a persona for a leader. They can show their status. And in previous time periods, when video and photography was not readily available, this was the only way that people knew what their leaders looked like. It can also establish a sense of legitimacy. And these portraits can often be read between the lines, right? Like we did with this portrait of Napoleon. He's obviously compensating for something here, right? Now, in terms of social commentary, now these types of representations of the human body are often political. Here we see a very famous Russian painting. It is the Barge Haulers. And what the artist here is trying to convey is the deplorable conditions of the serf population. So the peasant population in Russia during this time, in which there is steamboat technology. You can see the small boat here in the very corner, yet Russia is using these peasants who have very little rights. They are very poor in order to haul this gigantic ship onto land, because human labor at this point is much cheaper than the latest technology. Now, this type of painting seeks to rouse emotions. It should connect with you on an emotional level. You should feel what these poor men are feeling. It shines light on social injustices, as we see here, and it gives agency or a voice to those that history has forgotten. Because how often do we really see peasants and poor people represented in art? Right? Now, performance. Here is where we get quite interesting. Now, performance art blurs the lines between the different types of art forms, between performance, musical, theatrical arts, and the visual arts. It involves physically moving the body now, or decorating the body. This could be painting literally with the body, as we see here. They are painting with the female figure, or it could be something like tattoos, and we will look further into tattoos when we look at Polynesia. It is momentary. It is a moment in time. You can see that this is a photograph of an action. So it's very much action based. And it often evokes discomfort in that it being in a modern performance art piece is quite awkward. As you can see, all of these people sitting around are incredibly confused as to what's going on. But performance art is not as modern and contemporary as we often think here in the West, because, as I mentioned before, other cultures have been using performance art for thousands of years, and we'll be looking at those cultures in particular later on. Now, let's delve right into the topic of this week, which is the ancient Aegean. Now, this is a map of prehistoric Europe and the ancient Mediterranean, which is the area that we're going to be focusing on this week. Right, so you can see Mesopotamia right here, the land between two rivers. We'll also be looking at ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Now, the first one we're going to start off in Mesopotamia. And this is one of the first civilizations, cradles of civilization around the world. There are several that spring up all around the world independently, but we're going to be looking at ancient Mesopotamia. And we're looking at Susa in Iran. And this is the stele with the law code of Hammurabi. Now, you have probably heard of Hammurabi, I don't know, back in seventh grade when you covered world history. This is what we're seeing here is the first law code in the world. It was created to help create order in his empire. So before this, there were no set established laws for the entire empire. With Hammurabi, we see it literally carved into stone. Now, the code consists of around 282 laws, and these laws can seem sometimes very draconian to us, and sometimes they are quite progressive for their times. These are literal an eye for an eye sorts of laws. For example, if you murder somebody, your punishment is to be murdered. Of course, there are differentiations in depending on your social status. So if a poor peasant kills a noble, they will be killed. But if a noble kills a peasant, the retaliation will not be as severe. My personal favorite is what happens to an architect if he builds a building and it collapses on somebody else. That's right. He gets put into the building and it is collapsed on him. So, literal eye for an eye. What we also see, though, are some pretty progressive for their time period laws concerning women, their ownership of land, and their ability to divorce their husbands. Now, what we are really interested, though, in terms of this stele for this class is the very top here. And what we're seeing is a conversation between Hammurabi and Shamash, who is a Mesopotamian god. And here is a closer look at that. I know it's not great quality, but this was the best I could find. Now, what we see here is Hammurabi placing himself above his law codes, but also in conversation with the gods, as in to say, I received these laws from the gods, and my word is basically as good as the gods. So, a form of propaganda as well. Another example we have from ancient Mesopotamia is this head of an Akkadian ruler. So again, representations of leaders. And this is an exquisite piece. If you consider this was done about 2,000 years before year zero, which is about 4,000 or so years ago. It's about 14 inches tall, made out of copper, and you can see the detailing in terms of the elements and principles, the use of line, of texture. It is exquisite. And we know that the eyes would have probably been inlaid with some sort of gemstone, but none of that remains, unfortunately. Now, my this is one of my favorite pieces, and this is a lamasu. So it's a type of mythological creature. It is originally Assyrian, although the Persians are later going to adapt it. And we can see that it has a human head, the body of a bull, and it also has wings. So it's a composite creature here. And these were meant to be placed at the entrances to palaces and castles and cities. They are protective figures, and they are very much meant to scare you. The you can't see the scaling on these, but they are quite tall. They are much taller than a human figure, and they would have originally been brightly painted, as most things in the ancient world. Now, the fun fact about these Assyrian lamasu, as opposed to the Persian ones, is if you look at how many legs this lamasu has. How many does it have? It has five. So from the front, this lamasu would have been seen as standing on its front legs. And then as you walk past it, you see it on a side view with also its four legs. And I just want to point out here the stylization of the face, which is very Mesopotamian and looks very similar to this Akkadian ruler. So a lot of emphasis on the curly beards, the strong brows, and these almond eyes. Now, the next image we have comes to us from Persepolis. Now, unfortunately, this is all we have left of Persepolis because, well, Alexander burned it down. But we do have some beautiful friezes. These are carvings on the walls of these palace structures, and that's what we're going to look at here in Persia. Now, in this image, I just brought this in so you get a sense of what this city originally looked like. It was massive. It was the largest empire for its times. We're talking before ancient Rome. There was nothing like it in the world. And we're going to look specifically at these figures that are carved into its walls. Now, you see the same style, that Mesopotamian style with the stylized beards and the almond eyes here, but what you're seeing is a different depiction. Right? While previous Mesopotamian cultures would often show battle scenes, the Persians instead choose to depict tribute bearers from all over the empire. And you can see that better in this piece right here, where you can see the emperor, again, images of a ruler, in the center, and all of the dignitaries coming from all over his empire to bring him tribute. Now, the way the Persian Empire worked was that you had this vast empire, and they conquered quite brutally. So if you decided you did not want to be part of the Persian Empire, they would burn it to the ground and you would be enslaved. But if instead you said, okay, I'll join the Persian Empire, you got to keep your town, you got to keep your leader, you got to keep your religion. Everything stayed the same. And in fact, the Persians built infrastructure to enable trade with other nearby cities, and they would protect you against invaders. All you had to do was pay tribute. In other ways, in other words, pay your taxes, right? And this is what we're seeing here. So this is a different type of propaganda. It's not propaganda by fear, but it's basically showing that the Persian king rules over all of these people, and all of these people come to pay the Persian king tribute. Now we're going to, I know we're speeding through all of these examples, and I'll have videos for some of these in kind of the next section of the module for you to kind of delve a little bit deeper into some of these topics. Now we're going to shift over to ancient Egypt, and I bring this slide in because oftentimes I think when we talk about the ancient Aegean, we often talk about Egypt as if it was almost part of Europe, but it is very much a solid section of Africa. So when we talk about Africa, I won't be covering Egypt because we're covering it right now, but I do want you to keep in mind that Egypt is very much influenced by other Egyptian cultures and is going to influence other African cultures, which is what I meant. All right, so here we have the Palette of King Narmer, right? And this is one of the most iconic pieces of art of ancient Egypt. I know you're thinking the pyramids, but no, it is the Palette of Narmer. And the reason for this is because it is setting the rule book for what art will be in terms of showing the human body in ancient Egypt. This is a very, very early art piece from the pre-dynastic period. And what it shows is King Narmer in the center, right, defeating his foes. Now, I think I'll show you a video a little bit later on that talks about all of the iconography and breaks that down. You have um, gods and the prisoners being depicted here, but what I want you to focus on is the way that the human body is depicted. Now, if this looks a lot like the Mesopotamian form of depicting the body, you are absolutely correct, because all of these cultures are in communication with each other, they're trading with each other, and they are exchanging art styles. Now, what we see here is the use of hierarchical scale. So even if you don't know who Narmer is or what's going on, you obviously understand that the center figure is important because it is much larger than all the rest, and that is what hierarchical scaling means. Now, here we have some of these Egyptian art rules. Now, this would have been considered the canon, meaning the rules of human proportion. And the ancient Egyptians are all about stability. They are all about things staying the same. This is how they managed to maintain an empire for over 3,000 years. So, with the exception of a couple of rulers, for the most part, the art is going to stay within the lines, meaning using this grid system. So you often see the human figure depicted sideways, but with the shoulders being frontal. You're going to see the hands in full profile, the eye looking out at you, even though the face is shown in profile, right? And it's often very angular, as you can see it. The torso is this triangle. Now, each body part was a fixed number of squares, as you can see in this graph, and this style of depicting the human figure is going to last thousands of years. Now, another thing I want to mention to do with the human body and the ancient Egyptians is, of course, the process of mummification, which is a performance of sorts because it is a ritual in which the body is prepared for the afterlife. Now, in ancient Egyptian culture, this is not seen as the last stage of life. Instead, it is part of a transition to the afterlife. And most importantly, you would need your body in the afterlife, your physical, complete body. And so this is why the body is embalmed. All of the body parts are organs are put into canopic jars and buried with the figure. Now, with the human body. Now, reaching the afterlife was a complicated process. At the beginning, only the pharaoh or the king would have had access to the afterlife. But remember, this is an empire that lasts 3,000 years. And so by the later period, mummification and access to the afterlife becomes much more available to everyone. However, the quality of the mummification process really goes down, and some of the best mummies that we have preserved are from the Old Kingdom, meaning the very early periods of Egyptian society. All right. So we're going to skip right on to ancient Greece. And this is my favorite quote to describe how the ancient Greeks felt about the human body. And it states, "Man is the measure of all things," by Protagoras. Now, I'm not being politically incorrect here by saying man is the measure of all things, because it was quite literally the male body that was preeminent in ancient Egypt. I mean, ancient Greece. All right. Now we have a lot of different time periods in ancient Greece. We have all the way back to the geometric, which, as you can imagine, was very geometric. And most of what we find here are ceramic vessels with geometric shapes on them. In terms of the human body, we're going to start with the archaic period and then look at some classical pieces as well. Now, this is a piece of archaic art. This looks very similar to ancient Egyptian sculpture that you probably saw in your book. And this is a quarto, so this is a sculpture of a young man. Now, the ancient Greeks are going to see the male body as being the ideal, and they are going to celebrate male beauty above everything. And so you see that in this figure here. It is still very geometric, very similar to the ancient Egyptians. And it looks very solid and stable, which were all the goals of ancient Egyptian art, but are not necessarily the goals of ancient Greek art. The ancient Greeks have human like gods, and they very much put the human figure and man above the natural world. And so we are going to see a striving to recreate the human figure in art. And this is why ancient Greek and later Roman art is going to be so hyper realistic and very different than what we're going to see in other cultures, where that realism is not necessary to their culture. Right? Now, what we see here is Kore, which is a female version. Now, you notice that she is dressed. Most female figures in ancient Greek art are dressed. They never appear nude, not until the Hellenistic and Roman periods, so very late periods of ancient Greece under Alexander, and then in the Roman period. You can see that her robe is not particularly detailed. It's just kind of this one tube. Later on, they get a lot more detail and they develop what we art historians cleverly call the wet drapery effect, which is nothing more than the wet t shirt effect, where you can see the entire human figure below, but it's still technically covered in fabric. You can notice here that she was originally painted, and all of these figures would have originally been painted to look, again, as realistic as possible. Now, you notice she has this little smile on her face, and that is the easiest way to recognize in archaic sculpture, an ancient Egyptian archaic sculpture, because they always have this mysterious little smile on their face even when they are dying. So again, here in the sculpture, you can see that the musculature is getting more technical. They're obviously studying the human figure a lot more and replicating all of, you can see the ribs here and the calf muscles. Yet the face is still very archaic, right? The hair is very stylized, similar to what we saw in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, and he's smiling even though he's a dying warrior. So that's how you can tell that it is archaic. Now, we're going to skip over, and you can tell the difference here between these two sculptures. This is classical Greece, so 5th century. And this is Polykleitos' Doryphorus. Now you'll notice that most of these sculptures that I've been showing you say Roman marble copy from a bronze original, right? A Greek original. And that is because most Greek original sculptures were done in bronze, and all of those bronze pieces were melted down at times of war, which is the great loss for humanity. But thankfully, the Romans really liked Greek art, and so they made a lot of copies, and we still have those today in marble. Now, this was originally titled canon, and I often mention the word canon in terms of rules. This was the rule book, very similar to the ancient Egyptians, of how you were supposed to represent the human figure in ancient Greece. It sets out specific proportions and setting ideal correlation among body parts. So, what's really interesting about the ancient Greeks is they are going to have a very different take on beauty than we do. We like to think that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that's really nice because it means to somebody out there, you are beautiful. But the ancient Greeks are going to think that beauty is a mathematical equation that you can sit down and figure out mathematically what makes somebody beautiful. And they very much apply this to their art form. So this is what the Greeks mathematically figured was the most beautiful set of proportions for a human figure. And this figure is an actual bronze original, and this was found at the bottom of the sea, so we don't often have these originals. It's made out of bronze and it's made using the lost wax method. And now the last a couple of figures I'm going to show you come from ancient Rome. Now you can see a difference here because the ancient Greeks were very much about the idealized body, and even when they're representing their own rulers, they look very much idealized. Not so much with the Romans. This is a portrait of Augustus, and yes, I don't think Augustus was probably quite this buff, but his face is very much that of an individual. Right? He has that very Augustus haircut, kind of like a bowl haircut. And he has those features that whenever you see them, you can immediately tell that is Augustus. Now, as a side note, does anybody notice the tiny little buff baby in the corner? All right. We're going to talk later on about representations of babies, but let's just say that artists are going to have a really hard time representing babies in a naturalistic way for a very long time. And in the meantime, we get all of these creepy little man looking babies. Here is another example of an ancient Roman version of a bust. So a bust is a portrait from the chest up. And here we can see there's nothing idealized about this figure. He has wrinkles, he has a double chin, he's got jowls, his eyes are really small. Like he is not a particularly attractive man traditionally, right? And the Romans, as opposed to the Egyptians, are going to embrace age and they're going to see it as showing their wisdom. So, oftentimes, when you see portraits of leaders, they keep all of their wrinkles, they keep all of their sagging skin because they want to be seen as individuals. And we often refer to ancient Roman portraiture as including warts and all, because if somebody has a wart, you include it. There's no face tuning here. This is you exactly as you are. And if you go to Italy, sometime in the future, obviously not now, you will see this is in the Vatican Museum. This is an entire hallway with busts of individuals. And this is absolutely amazing to me. I get so excited when I visit here because each individual here is a person that lived, 2,000 years ago. And it every time you look at one of these, it's like you're looking at an individual from the past. And that's what's so fascinating to me about ancient Roman sculpture, that it is individual. It's individualistic. It is a person. It is a portrait. It's not just an idealized version of the human body. So I'm going to wrap up this lecture here. Next week, I believe we are looking at, well, after spring break, we'll be looking at ancient Mesopotamia. No, we looked at ancient Mesopotamia right now. Ancient Mesoamerica. So we will head down and look at the Aztecs, the Maya, the Teotihuacanos. So that will be fascinating. It'll be very different than what we've seen today. So I'll see you all after spring break.